Dan Mandis here covering the terrorist attack in Israel over the weekend. I want to welcome on into the program Robert Greenway. He's Deputy Assistant to former President Donald Trump. He did help establish sanctions against Iran back during the Trump administration. He was also the principal architect of the historic Abraham Accords, and he is our guest here on Nashville's Morning News on Super Talk 99.7. Robert Greenway, thank you very much for joining us this morning. So, boy, there's so much to cover. I don't even know where to begin. But let's begin with this. So there's this, because one of your main duties there with the former President Donald Trump was to establish the sanctions against Iran. So let's start with this $6 billion. You have a lot of folks that are saying, well, you know, the $6 billion in lifted sanctions from the Biden administration was not spent on any kind of terrorist attack, courtesy of Iran, funding the terrorism from Hamas and so forth. But you know, the Republicans will say, and I am conservative, you know, we will say, well, yeah, but if they had that $6 billion courtesy of the lifted sanctions, that gives Iran $6 billion to effectively fund Hamas through the money they already had.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you having me on, Dan. So first, I would say that the planning, as we know from the Wall Street Journal article that implicates Iran in this, demonstrates quite clearly that in April, when the decision and the announcement was made, that set in motion the planning. Again, that's according to what we've learned from Hamas themselves and from Hezbollah leadership in Beirut. So we know that set in motion the planning for the event. And second, when a line of credit is established, when you or anyone else or I get a guarantee that we have a certain amount of money available to us, that changes our spending habits radically, and you'd expect Iran to do that as well. But the more important point is $6 billion is nothing compared to what the current administration has been allowing Iran to have access to since they came in office. Their oil sales have increased. We sanctioned Iran's oil exports. This administration hasn't enforced them. So they made $42 billion in last year. They're going to make over $70 billion this year in oil sales. And for comparison, when we left office, they were making less than $7 billion a year in oil sales. So you can see that the $6 billion that they will get, thanks to the administration, is a drop in the bucket compared to what they've already given them.
Well, and so basically the Biden administration, in reading about this over the weekend, of course, have they been just looking the other way as it relates to the sanctions, or have they officially lifted the sanctions?
No, they have not. They have not lifted the sanctions. That would be even a step too far. But they don't have to. All you have to do is fail to act to enforce them. Yep. Sanctions, in many ways, are like administrative arrest warrants. It's a useful document. It's important. But if you don't enforce it, if you don't act on it, then it has no real value. It has no real impact. And that's, I think, what we're seeing here with Iran. You're also, by the way, seeing this in some aspects with Russia. It's a selective enforcement. But Iran, in Iran's case, they're now gone from when we were in office exporting some 400,000 barrels of oil a day. They're now exporting over 3 million barrels of oil a day. It's the most they've exported in over 15 years.
I want to play a piece of audio. Johnny needs some audio here. I want to play a piece of audio for you. This is President Joe Biden over the weekend following the attacks.
Israel has the right to defend itself and its people. Full stop. There's never justification for terrorist attacks. And my administration's support for Israel's security is rock solid and unwavering.
I've got to ask, Robert, I mean, knowing that Iran has been for, years and years been funding Hamas, when the president says that, you know, Israel, we stand beside Israel and we support Israel, full stop. Well, the president has been, seems to me, helping Iran to facilitate these attacks through, as we just talked about, the easing of the sanctions or the looking the other way on the exporting of oil. So it seems to me anyway that the words of the president, they're a little hollow.
Oh, there's no question about it. It's actually worse than that. We're actively, materially supporting Iran in every way you can imagine. And we've also dismantled deterrence. We used to be the brake on this. So when things got out of hand, we would be able to stop it quickly. We have, according to Secretary of Defense Austin's testimony before Congress in March, the United States was attacked by Iran 83 times since 2021. We responded to that in only 4 instances. So we've been dismantling our own deterrence and letting Israel and our partners and allies bear the brunt of it, and told them as much. And so, yes, we've been giving them access to resources by not enforcing sanctions, and then we've given them this hostage ransom payment of $6 billion. And we've also provided other avenues by which Hamas can support. I'll give you an example. The Israelis, as of yesterday, confirmed that some of the weapons used in the attack, Israel's 9/11, and I think that's an accurate analogy, came from the battlefield in Afghanistan after our withdrawal.
Yep.
And the president not only, over the course of this, wasn't woken up immediately as the attacks came. It took hours before they would. He's been only speaking to the public in this case for less than 3 minutes in his public remarks. And last night he was holding a barbecue at the White House. And this is, we learned that there were Americans inevitably killed, probably also wounded, and possibly held hostage as a result of this attack at this time. It's absolutely tone deaf, and it's incredibly difficult to understand. I'd also add that his national security advisor, just 9 days ago now, was on the record publicly stating that, in his view, the Middle East has not been this quiet thanks to their policies in a generation, and nothing could be further from the truth. They're detached from reality.
Yeah, Jake Sullivan, that audio, we were having some fun with that earlier. This is that audio.
And the Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades.
One of the things you talk about how he is, and President Biden is tone deaf. Robert Greenway, by the way, joining us here on Super Talk 99.7 WTN with the Heritage Foundation, talking about Hamas attacking Israel. And you listen to the administration and their take on all of this. When we talk about this intelligence failure, this massive intelligence failure, courtesy of, this was an intelligence failure on, Israel's part, clearly. How much of an intelligence failure was this on our part as well? How much responsibility do we bear, if any?
Yeah, well, we do, unfortunately. And having been someone in government that's watched this for over almost 4 decades, I have a hard time believing that we were, in fact, surprised by this. And I doubt that we were. What I think actually happened is the indications that we saw, which are sometimes only glimpses of what's actually going to occur, were discounted. And I think there are probably 2 reasons for that. One is that our attention is diverted elsewhere. You heard Jake, and when Jake is saying that, he's reflecting the administration's position. One, the Middle East is not a priority for us. It's not something that we believe we should spend time and energy and resources on. And number 2 is, we're paying closer attention to events unfolding elsewhere. And so those 2 factors can make you misinterpret or ignore information as you receive it. So I doubt that we were completely blind to this, especially if what the Wall Street Journal has reported is accurate, that we would not have been. I suspect that we just discounted this information and ignored it and potentially judged it to be unlikely. And now we're surprised by it. Israel is going to have to undergo their own sort of reckoning, because at a tactical level, there's no excuse for having not seen what unfolded on their end. But from what the United States is responsible for, we should not have been surprised by this at all.
So let me ask, Israel now engaged in trying to root out Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and they may have, we're reporting that there's possibly 4 Americans that are being held hostage, roughly 100 is what I'm reading. How does Israel rescue these folks? Because from your standpoint, do they know where these people are? Do they have an indication as to where they are? Because on the one hand, Israel wants to just bomb the living crap out of any place Hamas is. But on the other hand, they do need to try and save, these however many hostages there are. And some of these folks are Americans. So how does that change the dynamic?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. But first, let me say, just to be clear, that Hamas is a wholly owned subsidiary of Iran. And I say that for multiple reasons. The first of which is, if they are holding hostages, especially American hostages, which we know is true, then this is going to be incredibly difficult to do. But the first thing that in my judgment, should be done is to apply pressure where it belongs, on the party that made the decision, the head of the snake in Tehran. That's where the pressure needs to be applied. That's where the threats need to be made, and they need to be genuine, and they need to be actual and real, so that they feel it. And in that way, you could release potentially these hostages that are being held. That's where I would apply pressure That's perhaps the best chance we have of getting these hostages released without the use of force. If that fails, and I suspect that it might given the administration's position on this, because that's something only the U.S. can do effectively, then the matter of identifying and recovering these hostages by force is one of the most difficult things that can be done. And having been in those circumstances, I can tell you that it is not an enviable position, and very likely there are going to be fatalities. The best chance we have is applying pressure at the decision maker on this. If we have to use force to go into Gaza, into tunnel complexes, and support the Israelis do this or participate ourselves, it is going to be an incredibly ugly affair. And it's meant to be. That's why they grabbed them.
So I've got to ask, there's a lot of things that I've read over the weekend. You've got people that are writing and saying that America, because we are such a, by and large anyway, such a staunch supporter of Israel, that America itself could come under some form of attack in the next, 14, 16, 18 months. We all know about the wide open borders. We have no idea who is coming over our borders. But what we do know is that they're coming from all across the world, and we have no idea who's here or what their intent is or what they're capable of. So how could this impact America directly when it comes to our own, nation here in America, in the United States?
Yeah, so in addition to having Americans killed, wounded, and possibly held hostage as a result of this attack, our southern border has been open. We've had 200,000 illegal crossings in just the last 2 months. We're at record levels. And we know that hundreds on the terror watch list are among those detained. Who knows how many others made it through. I would assume, without question in my mind, that Iran and its surrogates and proxies have infiltrated the southern border and are currently present. And the demonstrations we've seen by pro-Palestinian groups after Israel's 9/11 on the streets in the United States in multiple cities and on college campuses is absolutely egregious. But it's meant to show all of us that they are in fact here and that they can be employed. And if the United States plays an active role, which it must, that they could potentially become operational. And I would remind you also that in 2011, Iran worked with a Mexican drug cartel, the Zetas, in order to conduct what they planned as a bombing in Washington, D.C. to kill the Saudi ambassador, Otto El-Jubeir. And so they have a history of working with criminal organizations to do it. And they've done it before, and we should not ignore that fact. And this is a consequence of having open borders.
I've got to ask, and it's such a fascinating conversation, but there was this attempted normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel that some say was the inspiration behind this attack. Talk about that quest that the Biden administration was looking for, this normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and if you think this was, because I don't think that, my own 2 cents, I don't think Hamas needs inspiration to go after Israel, but that's beside the point. But talk about this relationship, this normalization attempt from the Biden administration between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and how this may have perhaps inspired this attack.
So I do think it was one of Iran's principal motivations. They have two obstacles to exercising sort of regional hegemony or control over the region. And one is the United States, and they've been successful at getting us to withdraw from the region and to ignore it. The second obstacle to them is Israel. And if Israel's relationships with their enemies, with the Sunni Arab nations in the region, knowing that Iran is a Persian Shia nation as a whole, and so there's a epic long conflict between the two sides in this. If they can get both Israel and the United States to be reduced as obstacles, then they have no unquestioned control over the region and frankly global energy markets, by the way. And so Israel is the next focus for them. And Israel was working towards normalization with its Arab neighbors. That was brokered as part of the Abraham Accords under the Trump administration. And we were having conversations with the Saudis the entire time. And since then, the administration has come to realize it was probably the right path to follow and rightly has put resources behind it, but it's been sort of more rhetorical than material. What the Saudis were asking for is increase because they've had the conversations publicly, which I think was probably a mistake to do. But I can understand the logic behind doing so. And when I think they were appreciably getting closer to that, I think Iran judged that it was time to act and that the U.S. wouldn't actively impede them in any way. I would say, though, that it probably wasn't as close as some would imply, because most of what Saudi Arabia was asking for would have to go to Congress. And as you know, right now, Congress is probably capable of doing anything
Right.
until we get a speaker in the House. But this was going to be a complicated ordeal. But Iran, at the end of the day, has been allowed to spoil that. And the administration has been pursuing contradictory policies, trying to integrate Iran into the region rather than Israel into the region, which was our focus.
Robert, thank you very much for joining us here on Nashville's Morning News, and we'll look forward to having you again. Some great insight.